The simplest kind of dimension line is simply a linear dimension. So let's say we want to measure the edge of this strange piece of plywood that we're going to put on stage somewhere. I'm going to just come over here with the dimension tool in Vectorworks, but it's the same basic process if you're doing this with hand drafting. I'm going to click once over here, and I'm going to come over here and click once again, and then I want to offset my line. You don't want to put your line across the object. Sometimes it's impossible, but you always want to avoid putting a dimension line on top of the object. But you also don't want to put it so close that it gets hard to see. You don't want to put a whole bunch of dimensions all jammed together. Give them lots of room. If you need to rearrange your document, again, working in CAD, it's easy to move things around to get some room around your image. You don't want to have to jam them together. So I'm just going to put my first dimension line right there and see that it is 15 foot 0 inches. And 15 foot dash 0 inches is the method that we use. So remember, we use that cumulative inches thing on ground plans when we were talking about surfaces that actors would stand on. So it would be 12 inches and then 24 inches and then 36 inches and so on, stacking them up cumulatively. But that's the only place where we do that. Everywhere else in dimensions, we use the system where it's feet dash inches. Use the apostrophe for the feet, dash for the dash to separate the two numbers, and then the quotes for the inches. Now you do put 15 foot 0 inches, as we see here, if there are no inches, if it's a round foot measurement, but you do not put 0 feet 4 inches. You just leave that, just call it 4 inches. You just leave that off. Now if you're using Vectorworks or AutoCAD or whatever, it will do that for you, but if you're hand drafting, you want to keep those conventions in mind. Now, dimension lines are made up of two parts. There's the dimension line itself, and dimension lines are important. They don't want to cross each other, they don't want to be on the object as we talked about, and they don't want to have leader lines crossing them. So the other part of the shape is the leader line, and the leader line is just simply a line extending away from the dimension line, showing where the dimension line is measuring to, and usually the line will stop just short of the thing that you're trying to measure. Now leader lines are a little easier to move around. They can cross over the objects, they can cross each other, but they can't cross dimension lines. Nothing wants to cross that dimension line. So let's go ahead and add some other dimensions on here. So I'll grab the linear dimension tool, and I'll just click right here, and I'll click over here, and I'll create an overall dimension for this side, and I'll see that that's 24 foot 0 inches. Now let me measure this little bay over here and do a couple of things wrong intentionally. So I'm going to click over here. Actually, I'll do two things wrong, and then I'm going to click over here, and I'm going to extend this line over here. And you'll notice that by clicking there, I don't get the little gap right there, because the little gap is over here somewhere buried in that line. So the better way to do that, I'll just delete that one and do it wrong in a different way. I'll click here, and I want to measure to here. That's the actual measurement that I'm measuring. So I'll click there, and then I'll put my line over here, and then I will measure the other edge here, and I'll click here and here. Now those are the two things that are the wrong parts there. So you don't want to do those two things. Now the first one is you don't want to cross the dimension line. So in this case, what I'm really showing here is that 24 feet 0 inches goes from here to here, not all the way up to here, because this leader line is cutting across the dimension line. It's breaking the dimension line. It's suggesting that this is 24 feet right over here when it actually goes another 5 feet farther away. And this one isn't so bad, but you can easily fix this. You don't want to dimension right onto the object whenever possible. And again, sometimes it's not possible, but in this case, this is a super easy fix. I'm just going to bring it up here and put it in line with the 15 feet that we already had. This one is also an easy fix. We just move these guys around. And I'm going to leave a nice little offset over here because I'm going to want to continue my chain of dimensions down here. So I don't want to put it too close to where it's going to get in the way on my next few dimensions. So that solved the problem. So now we have, this is a nested dimension. I've got the 5 foot nested inside of the larger dimension. Always put the largest dimensions on the outside and the smaller dimensions on the inside. If there was a little notch right here that was 6 inches, we could put a little dimension right inside the 5 feet right here and measure that. But this is perfectly fine. Now let's go ahead and add a couple more dimensions down this side. And you can think about sort of creating a chain dimension just by going along each time there's a little contour chain right over here. We'll do this. And then we'll come over here to this little corner. Now there is a tool in Vectorworks. There's a mode for this dimension tool. It's the second mode over that's called the chain dimension mode. And that lets you just do this all one at a time. It goes click, 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 and then you scooch out the whole chain of dimensions. But you're probably not going to do that much dimensioning. It's a really good tool to be aware of, but you can certainly do it the way I just did here, just by doing each one individually by hand. And so now we've got a whole bunch of dimensions all nicely lined up in a row. You don't want to have these all staggered. So if you've got, this dimension here, and this dimension is like here. You know, that's not a tidy way to go about it. You want to keep those guys all in a nice, neat little row there in one particular rank of dimensions. So let's take a look at what's going on this side. We want to think about this circle over here. And a lot of times when you're putting dimensions on, one of the things that you need to think about is what is the information that the carpenters are going to need, the people who are going to build this going to need. Now there's a lot of kind of ways that we could dimension where this circle is, but if we think about the way that they're actually going to make this circle, it kind of makes sense of how we want to do this. So we can go to a known corner here, this guy right there, and this time I'm going to go and snap to the center of this circle. And it looks like I've got a little bit of a crunch in here. So I'm going to come up and move my original dimension, push that up a little bit farther, making sure to keep my 5 foot, or actually, you know, that could go down in this rank as well. Either one of those are fine, but I'm going to go and leave it up over there. And now I've got my 11 feet going to this corner, or to the center point of that circle, and now I can do the same thing from this edge to this edge. Realize that that's 4 feet, and I can go from this corner back to the center again and see that that's 4 foot. All right, so now we've got some, we know where the center of the circle is. They can come over here measuring off of this corner, double checking off of this corner. They can come in here and put a little X on the plywood there to know where the center of this is. Now all they need to do is figure out, well, how big is the actual circle. Now there is a tool called the radial dimension tool, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but you do need, in this case, we do need to add another circle. It's actually a circle that I've drawn on top of the circle because just Vectorworks doesn't see this as a circle. It's just a hole in a larger shape. So in order to get this tool to work, it doesn't have any problem doing these snapping to the center, but in order to get this little dimension, this little radial dimension line work, that right there, it does need a circle to go to. So just draw another circle on top of it, starting from the center and going outward until it snaps. Super easy to do, and then it allows you to draw that radius 3 foot 0 inches. And that's my preferred way to do it, with that, so the arrow pointing inside the circle to the edge and the radius there. If there's enough room for that, you can always have it off to the side and pointing at the circle too if the circle is too small to fit the dimension. Let's do the same thing down over here with this guy. We can come over here and say, well, they're going to need to know, like, how big is this hole? So I'll just start down on this side. I mean, I could probably maybe push these guys all back and do another rank over here, but I'm not liking that because look, it's kind of cutting across the edge of my circle there. There's just a couple of reasons why that's maybe not the best choice. I'm going to go down here and put it down on this edge, and then I'll do the same thing on this side. I'll come over here and I'll just line that up with my 4 feet. Now I can go ahead and do this just to fill it in because I've got a gap for it. I mean, maybe that's useful. That's probably less useful. That also gives us, again, if they want to do the math here and count up to the 11 feet, they could figure out how far down from this point is to this point. And we could do a redundant dimension. You know, we could come over here and do that again and just do 11 feet off to the side. That's not hurting anything, but you don't really need that in this case. But let's go take a look down over here in the corner and see what's going on in this little spot. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and now we're going to get into some spots where we have dimensions that get a little tight, a little small. So if I come back in and I finish my dimensioning over here, I'm going to go from here to here. So far we're okay. We've got our first fraction now, 3 foot 6 3/8, but there's plenty of room for it. Now let's do this guy. I'm going to click over here and click to the corner, and now I'm going to go right there, and now I've run into a little bit of trouble because that dimension obviously can't sit where it is. Well, I can just grab the selection tool and click on the actual numbers and just drag them away. And this is a perfectly fine drafting convention. If it's the very last measurement in a rank like this, as it often is, little notches and things, then that's fine to just drag it off to the end. Even though this won't fit inside the actual dimension gap, this is a perfectly clear way to do that. But sometimes you can't do that. So like in this situation here, I'm going to go ahead and snap to that corner and to this corner. And that 4 foot 6 is no problem. But now we're going to end up in some trouble here because that 6 inches is too small. And I'm going to come over here and do that to finish it. Now, in this case, you know, that's actually probably okay, the 6 inches there. But if it was 6.5 inches or something like that, that would be too big again. We would have it running over the 2 foot part. But so I'm going to do that same trick again. I'm going to click this time on just the 6 and drag it over. And if you accidentally drag the dimension, that can easily happen. Then just undo. It's not a problem. But just click right on the number and then drag it where you want it to go. And there's a little checkbox called leader line in the object info. And you can just add that little leader line. Or you can just hand draw it, or you can, if you are hand drawing, just drawing something that just kind of points at the object. That's perfectly fine. There's a couple of different ways that are acceptable to point at a dimension that is too small, but this is a simple and easy one to do. We'll do this one first, and I'll go over to this, and then I'll go from here to here. And now I can get this guy who's giving me trouble. I'll go on this side here. And now I've basically, by looking at this corner here, looking at this angle and the 2 foot 6 and the 2 foot 6, all that is basically telling me that's a 45-degree angle. We can just confirm that by grabbing the angular dimension tool. And the way that tool works is you click on one edge and you click on the other edge, and then you just drag off the circle, and I'm going to switch to, in the object info, I'm going to switch to the horizontal because I like it better. But now that 135 lets us know that if we were to add 45 to that, we would get 180. So that's just a way to confirm that indeed this, what is almost obviously a 45-degree angle because of those measurements, is indeed a 45-degree angle. And that's one thing I would say, definitely add those dimensions, add those arc dimensions on there for angles, because that's a really difficult thing to do. Grabbing a protractor in the scene shop and kind of squinting at an angle and those little tiny little marks on there trying to figure out an angle. It's so easy for us to add an angular dimension to just give the carpenters that number exactly without making them squint at a protractor. That's a really, even if it's something this obvious here, just to confirm that, oh, yep, that's 45-degree angles. You don't need to do that with 90-degree angles, of course, but anything that's not immediately apparent what it is, you definitely want to add that angular dimension on there. You do definitely want to add and draw attention to an angle that's like 91 degrees or 82.5 degrees, or something that's pretty close to 90. On first glance, it might look like it's a right angle, but if it's not, but it's close, you definitely want to draw attention to that, maybe even with a note. And with that, you basically have everything that you need to create the dimensions that you saw at the beginning there. So it's not that complicated. If you just remember, the rules here are to make sure that you give yourself adequate offset so that your numbers aren't all crunched together and makes it difficult to read. Of course, the line weight of the dimension lines falls into the drafting conventions category, so it's going to be a lighter line weight than these nice solid object lines over here on our object. You want to make sure that leader lines are crossing each other, but they never cross dimension lines, and that you have a nice nested set of dimensions, so the smaller dimensions are inside larger dimensions. And then whenever possible, the exception here is this angular dimension. That one you can get away with, but whenever possible, don't put dimensions on the actual object. And here we were able to, even a very complicated object, we were able to put all the dimensions that we needed on this guy, all on the offside edges there. And a carpenter is going to glance at this, and maybe they'll decide they want to figure out, well, what distance from here to here. But again, that's the place where they could sit down with a scale ruler and figure out some of those. But all the things that they need to lay this shape out here have been given to them in this set of dimensions.